Is this, do you know, is it like actually making noise or just, oh, you can hear it in here. Okay. Hi, everybody. First of all, welcome. Today we're engaging in a process to talk and educate, to begin to educate the campus community about the cliche term you hear thrown out about all the time about these public-private partnerships. And how, what's the decision-making processes around how even determine whether it's a good fit for higher education or for your particular campus. And so if you recall from the strategic plan that was approved a couple of years ago, one of the objectives of the strategic plan was to explore this as a campus and to begin to educate ourselves, to look at some possibilities, to engage with consultants who could advise us properly on this. And so today is really the start of that exploration of where we may be going and how this may fit with us or not at Cal State San Bernardino. I actually have a couple of slides that I wanted to share with you today. Uh-oh. All right, does anybody know where the keyboard is? We could do it the old-fashioned way here. All right, there we go. So what are we talked about some of the reasons why campuses may want to explore this for themselves. One is the number of revenue streams that come to the institution are relatively finite. It works now, thank you. We typically have relied on tuition dollars, state support, philanthropic support to support university operations. And we know that in times where both operational and capital dollars are getting tougher and tougher to come by at the state, that campuses are having to be more creative on how they may want to utilize the assets of the university to generate additional revenue streams for the campus. Another strategy, and it's tied to bringing additional or producing additional revenue streams on the campus, is the opportunity to bring non-revenue generating traditional academic facilities to the university. So the way that this may work in its simplest form, someone comes onto the campus who's a good partner with the university academic mission. They pay us a long-term land lease for the right of being on the campus. And in turn, we turn that into capital construction to support the growing needs of our campus community. Third areas we talk about is many of these public-private partnerships, and we'll show you some examples as we go through the presentation today, have a heavy tie to the research of our faculty on the campus. And you'll see many of them. Bottom line is you probably shouldn't even be getting into this if it's not strongly tied to the academic mission, and whether there are opportunities for faculty to grow, faculty to conduct research, internship opportunities, hopefully employment opportunities eventually for our students. And so pretty much wrap that slide up. So again, this is a reminder of the strategic plan. One of the goals of the strategic plan was around exploring ways to enhance the resources coming to the university. Specifically down at the objective level the goal was to start securing these relationships, but again, they have to make sense. And we're going to talk a lot about today about what makes sense and what may not make sense as we evaluate these, and to engage as many people into this process, because it's a little bit foreign for the way that we've traditionally brought services and programs to the campus. So I want to show you, if you weren't paying close attention to the university, the new campus master plan, so building off the strategic plan, we began the process of developing new master plans for the campus. And so you'll see in all of these, we'll show you, this is the San Bernardino campus. And up at the top left-hand corner, you'll see that we actually have isolated a portion of the campus for this kind of development over time. Now, is this the only area that we'll look at for development? No. There are tons of other little pockets and small areas that perhaps we don't have any intention of building on in any foreseeable future, but may be attractive to some partner who would be looking to come to the campus. We'll zoom in a little bit on this. You'll see that the light blue area off to the left shows where some of these buildings are. This is in the zone around facilities management and where the receiving area is right now. This isn't happening tomorrow, so the facilities folks don't need to worry that we're building on this. These are long-term negotiations and relationships, but know that we have isolated out areas of the campus that could be explored for this development. We hone in a little closer here, you'll see that the facilities area in this picture is still standing. And that in essence, most of this is going on from North Park along where the parking lot areas are in front of the facilities area. Now out at Palm Desert, we have a little bit more of a blank slate. You know, we have the 4 academic facilities on the campus now, and the opportunity to develop the campus in a lot of directions in a lot of ways. You'll see that the master plan here at Palm Desert is calling for this main campus spine to continue, which is currently the entrance off of Cook Street, and that public-private development may occur as both a, perhaps in that boundary zone between the University of California facility and ours. Also, as we think about student housing and other developments here, that you can see that there's plenty of opportunities to the south side of the entrance roadway when you come in for development on this campus. So on to the important part of our conversation today. I'd like to introduce everyone to Greg Goddard. Greg is the Senior Managing Director from FTI Consulting. Greg is he's a consultant who is the university advocate. It's important to note that he is not, he has been a developer in his past, but he is not the developer that would be working with us in actual construction of any of our projects. He is an advisor to the university. I had the chance to meet Greg at a presentation that he did for the entire CSU about a year ago, I want to say. And he has been working on active projects right now at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo down at South Coast Community College. And he has a partnership right now with Cal Maritime as they continue to explore options on their campus. So I'm going to stop here because I don't want to steal too much of his thunder. Today, what we're going to be talking about, and he'll introduce it, is we're just going to be talking about the basics. What is a public-private partnership? How might this work? How would we begin to explore these possibilities? And Greg will walk us through that today. Feel welcome, Greg, to the campus.
Thank you. I'm going to actually hook up here, so bear with me for just a second. We're gonna spend about 25 minutes going through my presentation. We're going to leave lots of time for questions. So that should be good enough. All right, am I coming through okay? Do I need to be higher? All right, let's get this thing going. Real quick, I've been doing public-private partnerships for over 20 years. I've been a real estate advisor, financial advisor, and consultant for over 30. So we started, my career started with public-private partnerships and privatizing military housing, putting a whole new program together, which ultimately was very, very successful in privatizing billions and billions of dollars in military housing. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about P3s. What are they? Why would you do them? And how do we do them? We're going to show you some case studies so you can kind of get some context around that. As Doug mentioned, a lot of today's conversations about context. Taking, what's this P3 stuff? So public-private partnership, we shorthand to P3. It's easier to say. And then we're going to talk about some of what I call the motherhood and apple pie of P3 best practices. So let's get right into it. Got a lot of words on this slide, but what this basically says is a P3 is any partnership between a public entity and a private entity to achieve a business objectives. Now we have two primary parts of a P3. Or two primary types of a P3, I should say. We have a monetization strategy, which is to take underutilized assets, often land, sometimes buildings, and try to get money so that we can deploy them to the academic mission. We will give you some examples of that. We also have what are called performance-based infrastructure projects, which are using commitments to spend money by the university or any other public entity over time in order to try to advance the development of a project that would not have gotten done under normal funding time frames. And I can talk about a couple of examples of that. So the difference between the two is that the monetization generates funding, and the performance-based infrastructure costs money, but it might accelerate delivery. So why are we doing P3s in the academic setting? Well, I think Doug mentioned a lot of this already. We're almost out of money on a lot of ways. There's tight budgets. There's been some success. Student housing has led the way, not so much in California. UC has done a lot of student housing, but also across the country, there's been a lot of P3s. For student housing, and has advanced and accelerated and improved the quality of the student housing available. And some of the deals being done now, the one that's being proposed by the UC, are actually getting very big. They're system-wide, and they're actually modeled after that military housing privatization that I mentioned before. So because it's a way to try to get more with less, they're becoming more widespread, and it's a very big focus, not just within the Cal State system, but within universities nationwide. But that said, certainly the Cal State system is in the formative stages of its program. We're going to give you a couple of examples, and there have been a couple of examples of successes, but there's a lot of activity, but there aren't a lot of done deals at this point. We'll give you some examples where that's not the case. And actually one close by, the Cal Poly Pomona's Innovation Village is an example of a successful deal that's been working for a while. The capital markets and rating agencies, those are kind of finance terms. What that means is the people that will provide money to these projects, and the rating agencies that decide how much risk there are in these projects for the people that provide money are very, very interested in this space, which means for these P3s to work, developers typically don't bring their own capital or money to a transaction. They typically want to be the smarts, the promoter, the brains, but then they go out and they'll put some of their own money in, but they'll try to raise the rest of the money from other people. As a matter of fact, one of the most famous sayings about real estate development is OPM, and that stands for other people's money. So having the capital markets and the rating agencies focused on this is very important to make sure that the money flows to these projects. And whether the money flows to the projects is based on whether they make economic sense. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means as we go through the presentation. Universities are also reluctant to use what is now scarce debt capacity. So you have a lot of projects that might be in the design build pipeline that you'll go out and you'll do more typical type of university funding, which would be to issue bonds. Well, every time you issue a bond, these rating agencies, again, look at the financial statements. Doug deals with this as the CFO all the time, looks at the financial statements and says, well, can they afford this? And some of the monies that get issued within the Cal State system are issued on a system-wide basis, system-wide revenue bonds, but they're also looking at the chancellor's office to the individual universities to make sure they're covering their own portion of those commitments. So this little graphic, I'm going to step to it and look at it a little bit, so I apologize, but this is really what we're talking about the pieces are. So we've got a project that's a big hole in the ground here, right? We need to be funded. So we have unfunded or underfunded projects that we want to get done. There are various asset monetization schemes. You could sell assets. In the Cal State system, most state systems, we don't really do that, but it's up there because it's a possibility. We can ground lease our land over a long term and receive money for that ground lease. And in some situations, there's opportunities to joint venture. Frankly, in the Cal State system, the ground lease is the primary asset monetization tool. And I can explain that more as we go forward. So then you also have, we talked about having availability payments, and those of you that are familiar with how student unions get built, other campus amenities, a lot of times those are tied to student fees and other sources of revenue that you did develop so that you can have facilities that you wouldn't otherwise have. Property tax revenue doesn't really fit in the bucket of the Cal State system, but it does with some of the community college systems. They're driven locally by how much property tax they generate. And there are other sources of funds. So if you had a ground lease and you get an annual ground lease payments, you can start to use that to help fund it. In the middle, we've got that capital that I was talking about. You can issue bonds, they can be tax exempt. You can get private capital in the form of debt and equity. And for those of you that don't do a lot of finance, the debt is like if you buy a house, you have to come up with your 20% down payment or 10% down payment. That's called equity in the real estate finance markets. That's what you have to come out of your own genes with. And the debt is the money you borrow from the bank. So when we talk about debt and equity, that's what we're talking about. So all that comes together in different ways for different projects, but it comes together to fund things. So when we're doing an assessment that we're going to talk about in a little bit, we're looking at how these various components come together depending on what the university's objectives are and whether we have projects that actually work. So that's what one of the things we're going to talk about, what we're going to be doing as your advisors over the next few months, and that's what we're going to focus on. So that's the next slide. So the first thing we do, this is pretty small. These slides will all be available to you, but we first go in and assess the current environment. I'm going to flip to it so I can start facing you rather than the screen. And then the next column is we look at an overall strategy. We do a lot of conversations like this. We've already sat down with Doug and some of his facilities and finance team a couple of times. Then we go out and look at how the market would respond to certain projects. For example, it would be wonderful to have a new hotel much closer to the campus. We can't just wish that into existence. We have to go out and make sure that the hotel will generate enough revenue above its operating costs that we can attract a developer and that all-important capital that I talked about earlier. So when we are in this phase, we're trying to make an initial assessment of what the art of the possible would be, given the unique characteristics of whether it's San Bernardino or Palm Desert, and see what potential projects there are within the viable or feasible envelope. We do that as an initial assessment, then we come back and report to the executive management, executive staff of the university, and we say, here, we've taken a look at it. It's a first phase look. Here's the things that we think you should prioritize and things that we think are viable. At that point, we've done some work. We think we've got a good project, but before we go out to an RFQ or an RFP and actually take a project on the street, sometimes we haven't done all the due diligence. So then we say, well, let's make sure we really understand what all the skeletons in the closet might be. And let me give you an example. Sometimes when you, I'm going to give you an example of a project that we're doing at Cal Poly now. It's a big piece of land. We're going to use it to build market rate housing. It's going to be available to faculty and staff, but also the community as a whole. That land has slope. That land has what they call a riparian area through it. Anybody on the riparian means that there's water and trees and everything that's sensitive from a ecosystem standpoint. So we look at that and we say, okay, our first blush, we think that land has some value, but you have to go and say, all right, when the developer that's really knowledgeable about this comes and sees this land, is he just going to say, well, you can't build here because of this, because of that, because of the other thing? We have the experience to assess those things, but we don't necessarily have the time and budget in the first phase until the university has said, hey, that sounds like something that we're willing to pursue. And by the way, these projects are not easy to do. So they have to be big enough to make sense. And I'll talk about some of the financial parameters of the Cal Poly example later to give you an idea. But it's got to be millions of dollars that we're looking to generate over time for the university. We don't do this for thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. These projects, everybody in here has a day job. And there's going to be a certain subset of the people in here and some that aren't in here today that are going to be burdened by trying to do a P3. So it's got to be worthwhile. It's got to make sense for everybody. And then once we decide that we've scrubbed it down enough, we've got the skeletons out of the closet, then we go to a solicitation process and we try to negotiate and close a transaction. So here's some case studies. This is the one that I was just alluding to. This was the overall, in the yellow here are all the sites that we took a look at for Cal Poly San Luis Obispo in our initial assessment. These, by the way, ended up being, they knew this beforehand, but they wanted to look at them, prime farmland. Farming and agriculture is very important to Cal Poly. It's a major part of their school. We were in a master planning community forum with mostly students. We made a decision, and the president made it right there on the fly. He had enough pushback that we were not going to touch prime farmland, even though from a real estate economic basis, it was probably the most valuable land in the portfolio. But the important point there, and Doug mentioned it, is this is all about making the university a better place. It's not about tapping into every possible dollar. So if this land is important to the university as prime farmland at Cal Poly, then we're not going to touch it. So after we looked at the initial assessment, looked at what the numbers would be, and by the way, they wanted a hotel. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. The perfect place for the hotel would have been right here, because this is California Highway 1. I don't know how many of you people have been out that way. So this was a great location for a hotel, and about the only good location for a hotel. Because what you can't see here is this is a lot of hills, and this is some hills too, and so you can't really see here. We ended up, as probably the lowest hanging fruit, picking this piece of dirt right here. It's about 22 acres. What you can't see, because it's not topography, is that it's generally flat from about here, slightly sloping, but you get out to just before these trees that you can see, and it kind of ramps way up. So that's what I was talking about, the example of looking at land and what it's really going to cost to develop it, which meant to us as the people assessing it was going to be more expensive to develop. So if we went to the university, we didn't want to just act like it was a nice piece of dirt ready to go, ready to go and you're going to get a super high price. We were realistic in our pricing on what we thought it would bring in the open market through a solicitation. So now we have selected a very high qualified developer. We are in negotiations. We're actually hoping to get concept to approval to execute the ground lease. We've already had concept approval with the CO. We're actually hoping to get board approval to actually finish the negotiations and sign the ground lease. We're hoping September. It might slip to November on the CO board meeting. But this project, if we meet projections, and that's one of the things about doing public-private partnerships, you could always run into the teeth of a recession, and that delays everything. And I'm going to give you an example of that in one of our projects. But this project is projected to generate hundreds of millions of dollars to the university over its 60-year life of the lease. Now, for those finance people in the room, there's something that's called present value, which is you look at the risk of those cash flow streams over time and you bring them back. The number's not that impressive, but the reality is over time, and there is a scenario where we might do it, we're looking at, once we get this project built, actually the developer is going to sell it to what's called a joint powers authority that allows it, will allow the project to no longer pay property taxes. All that benefit will flow directly to the university once the bonds are paid for, and it is projected to benefit, in that case, the lower case was a couple $100 million in round terms. In that case, it's almost $1 billion of revenue. So I just was on the phone with one of the finance guys at the chancellor's office yesterday, making sure he understood the cash flows. So we're going with the deal where you have to start with a deal that might be a couple $100 million. If everything is right, once this project gets built and interest rates haven't shot through the roof, for example, we'll be able to execute on that strategy and really, by a multiple of about 4, increase the revenues to the university. So a relatively small project, 420 apartment units are proposed, beautiful design, and could generate significant revenue to the university over time. So this is the South Orange County Community College District. So they were the recipients of this. Have you guys seen the old blimp hangars down in Orange County? That's the old Tustin Air Base, right? So they were hoping that both of them would be historical structures. Now they're figuring out they got to spend a lot of money to maintain them. So they may keep one now. and they're going to have to figure out how to fund it. So this land was all grant. The way it happens when a base closed, they do what they call BRAC process, and a local reuse authority. And then, so it was the city of Tustin that got to dole out land, but people, not people, entities, government entities can put in a claim. So the South Orange County Community College District put in a claim for 68 acres. It was a very difficult site when they first got it. And, but today, after, I've been working with them for 8 years, and I'm going to jump ahead to one of the infeasible projects here. When they first hired me back in 2008, they had already solicited a developer. They thought that they wanted a studio complex out there to provide internships for their students. The South Orange County Community College District is Saddleback and Irvine Valley College. It's those two colleges. So they were very excited about a studio developer that they had selected through an RFP process to do this deal. They started to figure, they used a public finance guy to do the RFP, and they figured, we really don't have the real estate expertise, so maybe we should hire somebody. I was fortunate enough to be selected. When I first looked at the developer, I said, I told the chancellor, I said, oh, I guess he was the vice chancellor at the time. He was ultimately promoted to chancellor. I said, you know, this thing's got a lot of red flags. And so here's what they are. But if you want to move forward with it, we'll move forward with it. But you need to know it may go off the rails. Well, I don't know, 2008, this was beginning in 2008, Lehman failed, Bear Stearns failed at the end of 2008. As a matter of fact, Lehman went into bankruptcy on September 15, 2008. I know that because the firm I was with at the time ended up running Lehman in bankruptcy. And I was involved with that for almost 3.5 years. So, but anyway, so we, at that point, even before that, that shut that project down. And at one point I said, and this was even before the failure, I said, listen, this needs to stop. This developer can't get this done. But they didn't have this nice contiguous piece. They had kind of these little pieces out. So I said, we need to hire you a development manager. And we ran an RFP for a development manager. And now what we've got today is we've got this nice 62-acre parcel. This is the development framework where we will have along the campus spine here, all educational buildings. And it's supposed to be all advanced technology that we can put community college students to work in after an AA. And anybody that's going to be, and then outside on the perimeters here are going to be corporate partners. But it's not just any corporate partner, it's somebody that can provide an internship, provide potential educational opportunities. So before we sign a ground lease with anybody, they have to show us how they're going to how they're going to partner with the college district. And we won't even consider them if they just want to try to make some money. Because in South Orange County, land is getting very, very scarce. So anyway, we're excited to have this project now appropriately positioned to take advantage of the post-recession environment. Because everything, you know, real estate's like this, but it's always going to go back up again. So we have a nice project. We're in active negotiations with 3 or 4 tenants right now. The first college building is getting built. I'm working on a negotiation to either do a lease back with a developer for the first building is being built for Irvine Valley College. Saddleback, we might do a lease back, or we're looking at a design build finance. But anyway, so that's an example of starting to work through a piece of property in a combination of an educational mission and a corporate mission. Many of you are familiar with Cal Poly Pomona. I'm not going to, Innovation Village, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it, but this was farmland. It was never going to be part of the campus, I think, Doug, isn't that, I mean, in terms of the campus core? Right. So they are now generating significant revenues by having Edison in multiple locations, the American Red Cross, and CTTI. This is an example. So in the federal government, we couldn't, a deal I worked on a number of years ago. The federal government, what happens is if you do a project and you bring in money, somebody up there in the budget offices in the federal government says, well, wait a minute. You got $40 million here, we're going to take it over here. So it was very much a zero-sum game. So in the federal government, we came up with what we called enhanced use leases where we could get in-kind construction. Now, it's harder to do in the state because they worry about, particularly as union oriented as the state is, which is fine, but they worry about collusion. They worry, they worry about, well, wait a minute, you need to bid the construction project. But in the federal space, this was an old dilapidated shopping center built in the 60s. It was horrible, but there were what we call QSRs, quick service restaurants, McDonald's, Taco Bell, name them. We had like 7 or 8 that were generating significant revenues around the perimeter of a 14, well, it says 15-acre site, it was 14 and change. We traded that. They built a beautiful new center that is just swamped most of the time, and they got a 55,000 square foot building for 40 years at no cost. Structural wise, they leased it, but it's actually the government's building. At the end of that lease, no cost lease, those improvements revert to the government. So I mentioned the first of the infeasible. It's important to note, I am a PC advisor, not a PC. It might be that too. A P3 advisor, I'm not a P3 advocate. And I have seen many more deals that I don't like than deals that I like. I'm all about being able to say at the end of the day, if we need to walk away from something, we're gonna. So I'm not one of these advisors gonna push you towards something just so I have something to do. I've got plenty to do. So they very much want a hotel at Cal Poly. They had a market study that said a hotel worked. But from a pure development economic standpoint, the market study wasn't complete. And so I looked at it and we did our own little market study and we did the, does the cost match up with the capital exercise? And I had to tell the president that his hotel that he wanted so bad wasn't going to work. Not only that, that hotel, if it was going to work, needed to be on that prime farmland that I pointed out before. It needed to, we can't just plop a hotel in the middle of a campus like that, particularly at Cal Poly, the way it lays out, and expect it to do anything but be a subsidized operation. Cal State Northridge is hoping to wrap up their negotiation on a hotel. They just had an announcement on a letter of intent. They have a very good location with lots of traffic. There are no hotels in the immediate vicinity. Looks like they're going to get it done. It's not a fat deal. It's not, but it's important enough to have a hotel there that it's all, we hope, going to balance out. I'm not working on that project now. I've talked to Cal State Northridge about it. I've talked to the Chancellor's office about it. So I make sure that I'm educated about what's going on. But that's an example. There are some things that aren't necessarily, that money is not the primary driving factor. It's having something, and when we talk about, I was just talking with the South Orange County Community College District day before yesterday, the chancellor there, she has a proposal from a number of her faculty about doing an innovation center, which is really kind of an incubator center. And so they've done an initial pass of the business plan. It needs more formation to a business plan, but we're going to be looking at that. And that's not, you wouldn't do that because it's a big money maker. You do it because it provides opportunity for students. This was just the infeasible. I already mentioned that. That was the studio that was going to go away. So the reason we wanted to put this slide in here is because we want deals that are going to be working from all sides and really benefit the academic mission of the university. So I want to talk a little bit about best practices. So we open with this every time we do a presentation. Well, we didn't open with it, but we make sure that we have it as a major part of the presentation, is that we want to let everybody know that this is what, as advisors, we tell the people we're going to advise first off, and then we try to stick to it and remind everybody if we start to go away from them. So you see the first one is the recognition of the primary primacy of the institution's academic mission. A recognition that the P3 is a long-term solution. These are long-term deals. You don't want to, there are short-term P3s, by the way. If you, for example, if you have excess land and somebody wants to store something on it that's not a nuisance, you can, sign a lease or a license to let them access your land. But usually in the context of a state organization, it's not worth the trouble because the monies aren't big enough. We always have to have transparency and competitiveness. We don't do any backroom deals. We don't do any sole source deals. If a deal is good enough for somebody to come through and say, hey, I got the better mousetrap, you got to let me do this, then you know what? We can compete it. And if in fact they have the better mousetrap, they're going to win that competition. If not, we're just going to put them in with anybody else. So we always have transparency and competitiveness. We're always looking to make sure that the risk ends up in the right place. We allocate and transfer risk. And the value for money analysis, that really compares to, for example, that's more of a performance-based infrastructure project that I talked about before. So if you're deciding whether you're just going to go through a design, build, and finance program that you would typically do, for example, to build an academic building, but you had a proposal to do it by a developer in a P3 setting, we have models that we use to make sure that it benefits the university to do it through the P3, and if not, we don't do it. Doug mentioned I provided services to Cal Maritime. Well, I'm done with Cal Maritime right now because what they wanted to do was they wanted to build housing. They were hoping that P3 was a solution, but they have a very complex problem there. And the biggest part of their problem is their rents are so low that you had to use the whole portfolio to make it so it wasn't a huge burden on the students. And some of the portfolio is still burdened by previously issued financing or bonds. So I looked at that, and then we were having our internal discussions with their executive staff and the chancellor's office. And again, I said, listen, if you want to be able to provide this housing, then you need to look at the SRB, the system-wide revenue bond design build solution, because you need to wrap in the power of the portfolio. Otherwise, it's going to be too big of a, we're going to have to more than double the student rents. Now, the interesting thing about the Cal State system now, their housing costs are about $5,500 a bed there. If you look at the newer campuses, their housing costs are about $10,000 a bed, $11,000 a bed. You know why? Because they didn't have any housing. What the old campuses have done, whether it's the Cal Polys or the Cal Maritimes, they basically have thrown all the revenues into this bucket, and then all of a sudden that's like you lose at the end of the day. Because then the last project they built they were only collecting $4,500 a bed, gross, that's what the student pays, and you have all the operating expenses. In 2009, when they finished their newest housing, they were paying $6,500 a bed in debt service, and debt service is after you pay all the expenses. So that's why you can continue to feed the beast for a while, but once you've tapped out all the money in your portfolio, it's kind of like, I'll go back to the housing analysis. It's like, all right, you bought a house, it went up in value. Hey, this is great, and this happened to a lot of people, particularly in places like Vegas. It went up in value. I'm going to refinance this house and buy another one. Well, if the music stops or you stretch yourself too far, rents go down a little bit, you end up running out of money to play with. And so that's where we are with some of that. And then in Cal Maritime, when we were talking about it with the chancellor's office in particular, it was that point, we're P3 advisors, not P3 advocates. If P3 is not the best solution, we're going to tell you that. All right, so this is my last slide. These are the characteristics of successful P3 organizations. Long-term planning, having realistic expectations. It's part of my job to help manage those expectations. Managing community relationships, very, very important. San Luis Obispo is virtually a no-growth market. Nobody that lives there wants it to change one little bit. But you know what? There's no place for people to live. Most of the people, like 45,000 people a day, commute in from surrounding communities to work in San Luis Obispo. They go to Atascadero, Paso Robles, down to San Marino, not San Marino, I've got a blank. Anyway, you guys know it, just Santa Maria. Organizational commitment, this is a lot of work. So we have to have enough organizational commitment. This is the next one, self-serving, but it's true. You do need independent transaction advisors because you need somebody to kind of act as referee and kind of the broker sometimes on what the realities might be. You also need somebody to say, you know what, it's time to stop this deal. I'm sorry, we've spent money, we've spent time on it, but if it's going sideways, you need somebody that says, you know what, you just got to stop. And it's very, very hard as a government employee, once you've invested a lot of time in something, to walk away from it. But you don't want this thing to like be a snowball that it takes on its, you know, its own weight and then falls apart when it hits a wall or something, and then everybody's looking around. You need to know when to do that. Effective stakeholder communication. That means everybody, we're doing that today. This is stakeholder communication. It's the beginning of a process. It means talking to the communities. San Bernardino is much more pro-development, for example, than San Luis Obispo, so we don't have such an issue. But you can imagine there's a lot of people back to San Luis Obispo that don't want to see that nice, pristine hillside with apartments on it. But we also owe it to the people that live and work around the university to have an opportunity to do that. And then legal authorities and defined approval process is very important that we have good documents to make sure that we're doing good deals. As a matter of fact, we did substantial modifications to the official template from the CO's office. I think they're going to adopt something like it. Not that the other one was bad, but you know, things just progress over time. So we made some you know, kind of lessons learned changes and are getting that final approval and process. But you need good documents that protect the interests of the university, because at the end of the day, that's really what we care about. Whoops, that's just our tagline. So with that, I don't even know, did I go over time? But I'm happy to answer any questions.
Who are the partners in the JPA?
Cal PFA, King County up in the Central Valley. So they did a couple of tax exempt bond financing deals, and they said, hey, you know, we kind of like doing this. We're good at this. And so what they do is they take a very small piece to use their tax exempt issuing authority. And then, so they're the ones we're talking to. They're certainly aren't the only ones that we could do something with at Cal Poly, but it's Cal PFA. They're very interested in doing it. They're very, we've got the legal opinion, because I was skeptical that you could have a market rate apartment deal and not have property taxes, but they've got the legal opinions and everything else. And so property taxes on 420 units, by the way, it costs so much to build, and it's based on cost, $1.2 million a year. So under that structure, as soon as they bought it, they would service the bonds, all the rest of the cash would go to the university.
I noticed in all the examples, they're either kind of newly acquired property or they're kind of at the remote end of campus, and we're talking about that. Palm Desert's another good example of that. You talk a little bit about whose responsibility is all the utility infrastructure. You've been talking about the buildings, but you got to get utilities to these sites and roadways to these sites. And how much of this burden sits with the campus, and how much of it is part of the deal?
Well, the answer is it depends. Right. So one of the things we did at San Luis Obispo, when we looked at the, 11 sites that dropped down to, 9 or something like that, I asked the facilities and planning people, all right, what is the cost to bring the utilities to the site? And so as part of our presentation to the executive management, we made sure that we were showing a net proceeds number versus a gross proceeds number. And then, but in terms of utilities, we think that we're probably going to provide the utilities, water and sewer at the very least for the Cal Poly project. And the reason for that is because we're in such a no growth market that we don't want the city of San Luis Obispo, who controls the water and sewer outside of our campus, to have too much leverage over us. We're starting to talk about whether they'll negotiate with us nicely. But in that case, and then usually the other utilities like gas and electric, as long as the hookups are nearby, they're not as complex because you have private providers providing those services.
Can you talk a little bit, so you were saying about the apartments, who manages those? What happens once it's built? Is it the campus managing that facility? facility? Or?
No, so in the cases of student housing, that is certainly the case that a lot of times there's a retained interest or operation by the campus. In these market rate apartments, and as a matter of fact, we're structuring these so that we are discouraging undergraduate student occupancy. Graduate student, this is really for families, adults, and grad students, because there's undergrads need to learn how to mature. I've got one that, she's very mature for her age, but still, we all know, you guys live with it daily. So in that case, in a lot of these cases where it's a market rate deal and there's not a student housing component, then it's basically that you're saying, here's a piece of land. How much will you pay me to use my land for the next, we start with 60 years there.
And then how does that work at the end of that 3 years?
We get the improvements back, or we can ask them to scrape the improvements and return the land to us in somewhat like the original condition. Once they do the grading, something, it won't be practical to have it that pristine. It could come back to that over time, but and we have some pretty strict maintenance requirements at the end of the lease, because what happens is people always use Band-Aids. Really the last 20, 25 years of the lease, which that's a long time so when you're looking at long-lived items, people, are patching them together. So when you end up projects at the end of the lease. So what we've done in our documents for that Slack and Grand, which is what we call that project, we make them put aside a capital replacement reserve in the last, I think it's the 15 years of the lease. So there'll be monies to fix things once they walk away. Yes, John.
The construction cost at the Cal Poly project, is it prevailing or non-prevailing?
We think it's non-prevailing, but it's not over till it's over, right? There's a lot of interest in, we're certain that technically that it's non-prevailing, because we're not making any investment of public funds. We're just providing a piece of land. But we'll just have to see where it actually ends up. So we've had the developer stress the pro forma both ways. But we have a lot of legal opinions, both inside and outside, that says it's going to be non-prevailing. But people start to stand up and jump around. We have to figure out where it comes out. So. Not that many. I'm aware that it's one of the things that we'd like to try to get out of this. One of the keys to the sports complex is having the community, the community overall have a need as well, so that you can start to generate user fees outside of the, burdening the students with a student fee. So that's one of the things when we look at the potential here, we're going to have to consider in terms of a kind of if in fact you can build a regional sports complex. As a matter of fact, I'm going to one that is almost brand new. In June, my daughter is a field hockey player, and they have this national tournament in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, of all places. Spooky Nook, I think it's called, and they have a brand new sports complex facility. There wasn't a university involved, but there was an economic development. There was a local municipalities were involved, so a lot of people got involved to make this come together, because it's a big economic driver now. It's not just field hockey fields; it's all sorts of fields. So they're bringing people from all over the country to play there. They've got hotels there. So, there are examples where it's put together, but on a pure university basis, on a university that's not extremely well funded on a sports basis, they're frankly more difficult to do.
When you look at the regional economy, there's a lot of industry coming, there's hotels all over the place.
Right.
There's, I think, Nordstrom, Amazon, all that. I assume you guys look at all of that to see how we'll support
Yes, we do. So, when I talked about being in this business for 30 years, I started as a real estate guy. I started doing development feasibility for people, and I've done it for everything. I've done it for hotels, industrial, retail, office buildings, residential. So we look at, you know, and that's a good example. There's a lot of distribution space that's been built in the immediate proximity. That's not a great use for us because, one, we don't have enough land. But how can we play off of other things that are happening that might be offer better partnerships for the universities in terms of, you know, place for your students to interact with real corporations and learn?
So on that front, is there a track record of that being successful, that kind of partnership towards a different value proposition?
There are examples of successful research parks and incubator parks. Incubator parks are higher risk. And there are probably, frankly, more of them that have failed than there have been successful. So part of it, sometimes you have to, the community college district was a little unique. They were given that land, but you guys have land that's already, you know, here as well. And then they made a conscious decision, and they had some funding to make investments in making that land available. So one of the biggest questions is, how, you know, what kind of investments are we talking about? But it was, rather than trying to take out a big chunk of that and just throwing it out and say, anybody want to come build a building for us, or, you know, or build a building for yourself. And I think there was probably a little bit of that in Innovation Village as well. You're kind of creating an environment that's going to be attractive and gives you something to market. And then that is better than the build it and they will come incubator. As a matter of fact, when I was talking to the chancellor on Monday morning, and she said, I'm going to send you a bunch of emails about this incubator. She has personally had experience in her 30-some college career of one very successful incubator and one just disaster that she, fortunately for her, she, at least it wasn't on her, she inherited it, right? You know, I inherited the bad one, but, you know, so it's a matter of identifying those care. And up at Cal State Monterey Bay, UC Santa Cruz, the same thing. It was a BRAC project. That base closure is what I mean when I say BRAC. UC Santa Cruz claimed a little piece, even though it wasn't really very close to Santa Cruz, and they built an incubator space, and all it does is have a bunch of, you know, kind of whatever tenant they can get in there.
I think that the T's and C's, the terms and conditions would be really important because, you know, there's a lot of things that are going to play, right? If that company's HR process doesn't facilitate our students, or I mean, there's so many different components to them saying why they may not be able to perform.
Right.
And so I think, yeah, that's interesting.
Well, and we, you know, for right now, we have a better locational advantage, candidly, in South Orange County than you do here, although you are in the best spot of San Bernardino. And Palm Desert has attractive qualities about it as well. There's a desire for people to locate, and, you know, as the land gets less and less available, people will say, yeah, you know, this works. Well, for example, we had a acute care rehabilitation hospital that we were this close to getting a deal done with. It fell apart for a variety of reasons. One is because at the time we didn't have our first building going up yet, and so we asked them to fund our first building, and we would buy it back within the first 5 years. And at first they're like, yeah, fine, no problem. But then the real estate guy that was running their real estate operation got a little nervous about it. The CEO changed his mind, so it just cooled down. But right now we have surgical centers. We have a major diagnostic lab that's interested in this space, and it's really just because we provided them a location where they can be, and you show them that you're going to have a potential labor base there. So those are the kinds of things that we would focus on here. Is what, you know, what are the realistic objectives and aspirations that we have. We don't want to, I mentioned the art of the possible earlier. We don't want to be too skeptical too early, but we also don't want to be pie in the sky. So part of that whole first 3 columns is to try to figure out where we fit on that spectrum for different uses that we might consider. Yes?
Are these buildings considered 100% private on public land, or is there an MOU for goods and services, existing staff support, the lighting, you know, things like that, the infrastructure that makes them run once they're finished? It's
typically the latter, with service provisions for things like, you know, electricity and so on. For example, if it's infeasible for them to tap into private utilities just because of location or something, typically what we will do is we will have them pay market rates, not what you guys not your cost, but if they had to go out to the local provider. But other than that, you really want kind of to have them do their own thing. When we first looked at when I got first invited to the first planning meeting for this project here, they had brought in this university master planner and they had said, oh, this is great. And they had all these along this main campus spine, which was at first, they said, well, we want to have a lot of great partners. Doug's laughing because he's heard this story. We want to have a lot of great partners. And I was sitting in the back of the room. No, this is, I think, their third charrette. Nobody had seen me before. But I looked at that and I stood up and I said, I beg your pardon, but you can't do that. Everybody looked at me and said, what? I said, you cannot put, I don't care if it's Apple. You can't put Apple right here in the middle of your campus. And here's why. Eastman Kodak was once the biggest company that anybody, you know, in the country, in the world. Where's Eastman Kodak now? They're going to build a corporate facility that's unsuitable for student occupation because we have DSA rules, right? And Department of State Architect says you have, you know, so they're going to spend $250 a square foot building a nice building. It would cost $450, $500 a square foot to build a building that the DSA thinks is safe enough for your students, particularly in the middle of a campus. At least the numbers we're seeing from them now. You guys might argue on the facility side, you might argue the numbers, but the fact is there's usually a factor, multiple factor of about 2 on the cost. I said, but what we can do is we can have you dedicate this to all educational users. They don't have to be all community college. We had Brandman University looking at it. We had some of the Cal States say maybe we'll do a satellite. And then we can have proximity. These look like streets, but they're really mostly limited traffic thoroughfares like you have around here. And you can have gated access. So the kids that have you know, internship, they just go swipe their card and they go right into the office building to go to work. So because that's a long answer to your question, in certain cases you want to keep a separation, right? You don't want operationally, which what your question, you don't want to get things too complex. You basically want them to build their building, pay you your rent, and if they don't, you have remedies. There are exceptions, but I would say that's probably 80% of the time.
Did I hear you correctly? I think you mentioned unsuccessful P3s where the university ended up subsidizing the cost. Did you say subsidizing, meaning that this could turn into not a money-making?
No. I have never, I've never closed a P3, personally, I've never closed a P3 that hasn't succeeded. I'm sure they exist, like in the, but usually on like the incubators, some universities use their own funds to fund incubator space. Then they look for revenues to offset, hopefully start to pay off the capital expenditure on that, and then to offset the operating expenses. That's not technically a P3. That's just, I got some land and I'm going to build a building and hope it works. Like Cal Poly's been discussing having a business, you know, kind of incubator in the middle of their campus. But when you do it with a private party, you structure it in such a way that if it doesn't work, the worst case scenario is you get your land back with a building on it that you can use for something, right? You may not be able to have classes in there because of the DSA rules, but you make it so you can have it, can use it for something. So that is, that's again why we try not to, you know, make it too much of, hey, you take this half of the building, we'll take that half, and you know, this will be great, we'll be partners forever. We really don't want that. The college, by the way, Saddleback College and the college district, they had a long-term apartment building that had been built in the 80s right next to their site. And in 2012 or 11, it got foreclosed on, just because a lot of factors. I don't know the details. Meanwhile, the rent on that to us as a school was almost $3 million a year. There was Bank of America had done what they call a CMBS, a bond loan that had sold out, but they were responsible for trying to get the money back. As the university in that, or the college in that case, you're in the catbird seat, because if they don't keep paying you your $3 million a year, you end up with an apartment building.
Right there, you don't have to wait for the.
Well, no, well, so the thing is, it never happens that way, right? Because what the bank took it back, foreclosed. They sold it to somebody that priced in that $3 million a year rent and figuring out what they could afford to pay for the building. Within a month of closing on it, they came to us and said, "Hey, we'd really like to clean this thing up, but if we do much with it, we need a longer lease." I said, it ended up being great, because what we did is we extended the lease. The board was like, "We don't want that lease any longer." I said, "Yes, you do. Here's why. First off, because it was like the last 25 years we talked about before, nobody's going to spend any money on it. You have no need for the land. And we had a terrible lease. It was written in the 80s, and it was just terrible. And we'll require a lease that protects all your future positioning. And guess what? I'll get you a lease execution fee for it too." So we did that. We spent a few months negotiating. It was already built, so it wasn't as hard as doing a new deal. But we ended up getting a $3.5 million fee just for the pleasure of them extending the lease. They are continuing to pay almost a $3 million rent that goes up a minimum of 3% a year, which you can't get that anymore in today's market. You can't get $3 million, 3% mins on the CPI. It's CPI, 3 min, 6 top, and we have a lease that is just much better than we had before. So as we get towards the end of the lease in another 20 some years, we'll be much better positioned to say, "Hey, you guys can't let this thing go." So there, that's an example that just kind of keeping the separation.
Following up on those, with the something like the Edison at Cal Poly Pomona, in their terms, or do you have any experience where you've actually required tenants to say, "You will fund 20 interns per year," as a part of their condition to meet our academic missions?
The answer is yes. That is when I talked about the fact that we haven't predefined the level of involvement, but every tenant that we sign at that site down there on the bottom will have to make a long-term commitment throughout the lease period to provide opportunities to to students. As a matter of fact, we had a medical office building developer that came to us and said, "Oh, it's a great place for a medical office building." I said, "I don't think you can do it," because he didn't have tenants already signed up. It was what they call a speculative building. He was going to, kind of get some tenants signed up. And I said, "Well, until you get tenants signed up and they can commit to a long-term internships, and we get a bank to say that they're willing to fund that, we don't have anything to talk about." Guy's been running around like mad. That's where the diagnostic center is coming out. He's got 2 surgical centers. Like, fine, we'll do that. Because a lot of times interns, and it's got to be the right type of intern positions too. There, we're not going to, being a receptionist is not. That's not an internship, right? That's an opportunity to make money to pay your expenses while you're at college, a little bit of them. But we're talking about meaningful internships. So that's an example of making sure that's part of it. No, it has to be, because if it's not an event of default in the lease, then times change. It's kind of like my Apple example. And what happens is that you may be willing to renegotiate certain things in later periods based on conditions changing, but it gives you the power. It gives you the authority to decide what works and what doesn't work.
I just was going to add, we maybe a year ago took a tour of the LA Crime Lab Center at Cal State LA, which is a similar model of this. Not only was there internship opportunities built right into that deal, that relationship has grown to the point that the criminal justice department left their college and have moved into the ground floor of the building now. They've renovated the ground floor to be what feels like a traditional college environment with classrooms and faculty office space. And to get up to the
investigation levels, it's kind of like getting into Fort Knox, but it's entirely now become Cal State LA interns, and most of the professional positions are going to interns who eventually get hired into pretty high-paying jobs there.
And the key there, a lot of times, is to show them that you have a piece of dirt that's ready to go, right? Because if you say, well, we can kind of do that, but you have to wait for us to do this, that, and the other thing. So that's one of the things is when we're assessing things, we have to figure out what's a realistic position to be in to get that kind of project in. All right. Well, thank you for your attention, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. Thank you.